So I thought I'd make a quick video discussing tips and tricks, as it were, of playing without nails. It's important to note that these aren't necessarily universally applicable. They're things I've discovered through research, conversation, teaching. They work for some people, they won't necessarily work for others. And one or two of them may be a tiny bit controversial, who knows. So first up are the ways we can deal with dry fingers. One method, which I've seen no-nail players use, and nail players use as well, is to immerse your fingers in warm water for a period of time, say 10 minutes, and then afterwards the flesh and the nail will both be quite supple and soft, and the sound consequently quite beautiful. You may have noticed this if you've had a shower and then played the guitar immediately after and produced quite a pleasant tone. The problem with this is it can make the skin vulnerable to different extents depending on the person. Certainly in my case, it makes me vulnerable to blistering, so I don't do it. What works better for me is to use some kind of moisturizer. So most of the time I've used something like this, a sort of daily hand lotion. Recently I've started using something that was recommended to me by a very fine player, and it's a bit embarrassing, but it's this, which is nipple cream for breastfeeding mothers. And it works remarkably well on the fingers. Really, you only need to use a tiny bit of it, which is great, and I've had no problems since I've used it. The skin has maintained a very nice texture. Which brings us on to calluses. Now, the best tip I have for how to deal with calluses is simply not to get them. And we do this, as I say, through moisturizing or avoiding using the fingertips when they're in some kind of vulnerable state. However, if that fails, there are people who use nail files to file down the hard skin. Sometimes they've used some sort of fine grit sandpaper instead. There are even some historical references to this being done. Again, I don't like this myself. It makes the skin more vulnerable, therefore creating more blistering, therefore worsening any situation with hard skin. However, it definitely works for other people, maybe with different fingertips, different types of fingertips. There are some other solutions I've heard of for helping with your fingertips. Rob McKillop uses beeswax. I have used that, and I did have it somewhere on the desk, and it seems to have disappeared. It works very well. The strangest one, I heard of a bongo drummer who got calluses and recommended immersion in urine, of all things. Now, I've not tried that one, but there we go. Certainly, immersion seems to be a common way of dealing with this problem. So another thing to consider is the length of the nail. Commonly, when we play without nails, we forget entirely about our nails, but our nails do make a difference. If the nail is too long, it will start to catch on the string. I'd be careful when you file down the nail to also file down the corners, which sort of get tucked away in the pockets of the finger. But if they're a bit sharp and a bit long, it's quite easy to catch them, I find. Also, if you have quite a fleshy fingertip, you may want to grow out the nail a bit just to support the flesh. Not so far that you hit the string, but just enough to give a bit more firmness to the flesh. I do this to a tiny extent. Also, it has to be said, you can use some nail. It's not one or the other. You don't become a no-nail player and never use the nail again, or even become a nail player and never use flesh again. There are options to alternate. You can do it with the thumb. I can raise the hand a bit and play the thumb with nail. I can lower it and play with flesh. I can curl the fingers in and play a chord with nail, and put them out and play with flesh, like that. And there are some people who even have a very sophisticated nail shape, growing on one side, and by rotating the hand this way or that, they can actually switch between flesh or nail. So it's definitely worth experimenting with that, and I may do a video on that at a later date. Another useful thing is to rest the little finger on the soundboard. Historically, this correlates very highly with flesh playing. Nail players tended not to use it. Now, flesh players in the 20th century didn't rest their little finger, so you don't have to do it if you play with flesh, but certainly many people like it. Now, the important thing to note about it is that it should never be sort of firmly placed on the soundboard. It shouldn't be pressed hard. It should just be lightly touching, usually as a consequence of the hand position. The hand drops down and the little finger is naturally touching. It's just there as a point of reference, just like resting the thumb on a bass string. It's quite useful, especially for doing fast runs with P and I, with the thumb and the index finger, which is a technique probably more common among no-nail players than nail players, and tends to use more hand movements than going with M and I. And so having the little finger there helps to stabilize the hand. The other thing I must note is string types. Now, you sometimes hear it said that you need a special kind of guitar to play without nails, maybe a smaller body guitar or a historic guitar. Not true. There's really no truth in that at all. No-nail players historically and presently use all types of guitars. Anything can work. Strings are a bit different in that there certainly is a preference among many no-nail players for strings with some kind of texture. So rectified strings or plain gut strings, or sometimes a player will use a standard smooth nylon string, get some sandpaper and rub the playing area of the string down a bit to rough it up. And the reason this is preferred is because it gives you a bit of grip on the string and helps control the tone. This is also true in the left hand. As someone pointed out to me, which I hadn't considered before, everything we play on the left hand we do without nails. So it helps to have some grip there too when doing a slur or a vibrato. Sometimes you see it said that you need low tension strings to play without nails, or that it helps. It definitely helps at first. If you're just starting out, go with low tension. You'll avoid any injury. But once you've got good at it, there's no reason not to use high tension strings if you want to and if it works for your playing style. Many no-nail players historically use high tension strings. Some do now. I tend to prefer normal to high tension strings. I can push more, less likely to buzz. I think if you use low tension strings without nails, it's often quite a good idea to up the action a bit, because you do tend to push a bit more without nails than with, I think. Finally, is a very general point, but I think so important, which is that we should be guided by our fingers. One of the most dispiriting things I see is when a nail player converts to playing without nails, or is just trying it out, and then is trying to recreate a nail sound. Invariably, this won't work. You've got to develop a new ideal. Our fingers are unique, our sound is unique. One of the glorious things about the guitar is that there's really nothing between us and it. There's no mechanism as with a piano, there's no reed, as with a wind instrument, there's no bow, as with a violin. We're cradling this instrument in our arms, in our lap, we're directly in touch with the string. It's so personal, and we should embrace that and discover the particular characteristics, the personality of our sound. None of our fingertips are alike. And this is especially true without nails. You're just using the fingertip. We can't change the shape of our fingertip like you can with a nail. We have to work with what we've got, and we have to embrace that. And then the sound can be so beautiful as a result, I think. Anyway, I'm sure there's many things I forgot to mention, but I do have a website dedicated to this subject, which is nonailguitar.com. On it, you'll find some posts about technique, which contains some more tips and tricks, I think. So please do go check that out if you're interested. And thank you for watching.